G'day, I'm Owen, and thanks for joining us for this week's episode of The Pub Test. And this one is a little bit different to the others. There's no murder mystery here. In fact, these crimes have been solved, but it was such an intriguing story, we thought we'd just go through it. And we'll be discussing the case of the After Dark Bandit. The After Dark Bandit robbed banks in regional Victoria, Australia between 1977 and 1979. The bandit has been accredited with at least 24 robberies during that time. Now, the tab offices that they robbed, or the TABs, were little betting agencies where you would go in with your cash, obviously, because you didn't have the phone apps back then, and put your money down. So those places were really well cashed up and frequented a lot when people had finished work. Now, that little bit of detail is fairly important because this robber would turn up close to closing time and always, or predominantly I should say, when the cover of darkness was around. And that meant, after completing the robbery, well, they could use that cover of darkness to escape by various means. So this person became known as the last Australian Bushranger. Now, realistically, it was 100 years since the last Bushranger had been around. But what is a Bushranger, to explain why this person got that moniker? Well, a bushranger was a career criminal who lived out in the bush, the scrub, would come in, perform a robbery, and then disappear again until they came back another time to perform more robberies. And eventually, more times than not, they got caught by the police. In other places, you may have outlaws, or we may think of Robin Hood as perhaps the original bushranger, from the sense of a robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Yet, most bushrangers robbed from the rich to keep it pretty well much for themselves. So what's the intriguing thing about this? Because it's just simple bank robbery, isn't it? Well, no. And this is where the notoriety of this particular case came out. Because the After Dark Bandit would turn up wearing a particular mask and particular clothing, rob a place, and then take off. But almost at the same time, in another regional town, the same mask, same clothes, would appear the same person is robbing another place. Now, security cameras back then aren't what they are today. But this really confounded the police because this person is robbing one place and then he's taking off and doing another one. Could he have been getting there in time? Well, could have been possible on some of these. But the police were really confused as to how these crimes were being committed. And the crimes were always committed outside of daylight saving time. So in Victoria, Australia, during the winter months, you don't have daylight saving. So around 5:30, even 6 o'clock, it's pretty dark. But when daylight saving kicks in the summer months, it would still be light up until 8 o'clock in the evening. So the After Dark Bandit only performed his robberies during the winter months. So after a couple of years of getting away with these crimes and confusing the police, this bandit decided to rob the Heathcote Bank for the third time. But it didn't go very well. A police officer was shot inside that bank twice, and the bandit took off. The following day, another policeman had suspicion seeing this person walking down the street. He followed him. They had a bit of a scuffle. and he was found out to be the After Dark Bandit. Now, it's important to note here that whilst this police officer was shot twice, and apparently a bullet was lodged very close to the heart, he did survive. And he lived for another 16 years after this robbery. Now, just because somebody wasn't killed doesn't excuse violent robbery. But I think the consequences would have been way more extreme had that police officer passed away. But now, will he give up how all these robberies were committed? Yes, he does. And he does so very quickly, which pleased the police no end, and no doubt the general public were quite happy. But there was one person decidedly negative about him spilling the beans. And that would be his twin brother. So the man arrested initially was Peter Morgan. And then he threw his twin brother immediately under the bus. So Doug was soon arrested as well. They both were sent to prison and served their time. But yeah, they had this scheme where they would wear the exact same clothing, exact same mask, and go and rob banks at very similar times. And back then, that was just confounding everyone. But what's interesting here is why. Why did they go on this spree? And like most Bushranger stories, it was a bit of hard luck for them. They were in the building industry in their early 20s, and back in the 70s in Australia there was a massive slump, and they didn't get paid for their contracting work. And so they said, well, how about we go make some money? How about we take the money where we know the money is, from the banks, from the betting agencies? Now, you might think that's a big leap, going from not getting paid to let's go rob a bank. Yet it was in the family line. Their father, Kay Morgan, was a notorious criminal. And quite eerily, he was caught the same way Peter was. So yes, Kay Morgan robbed banks, and in this particular time, he also got involved in a scuffle and shot a police officer. He got away in his getaway car but crashed into a ditch and was then arrested. In a very similar way, isn't it, to the way Peter Morgan was apprehended as well. Now both the brothers are out of prison. They're actually back working, building a house together, last report. Peter regrets throwing Doug under the bus. They had an agreement that if one of them were caught, they would give the other one 12 hours to lay low. But that didn't happen. They seem to have mended their bridges, even though apparently they still have their moments. And for them, they say it was an adventure. I mean, we like the story, don't we? Robin Hood, robbing from the rich. These poor young guys were messed around by the system, and so they were taking it back from the system. But the reality is the guns pointed in the faces of the people who were handing the money over were just people like you and me. They weren't the chief executives of these banks making the millions of dollars. They're there just making their daily income as well. So they do regret the intimidation to those people. And I think we can all respect that, at least. A news reporter who was following this case named them the After Dark Bandits. And he has since written a whole book about the story of Peter and Doug. So if you're interested, you can chase that down as well to get more of the detail on this quite intriguing case. And it does paint a picture of the history of Australian criminals, the Bushrangers, the ones who were beaten down in some way by the system, and this was their way of trying to get back. And whilst we've already discussed, it doesn't justify people committing crimes, but the average person has a sympathy for these ones who were doing it because they felt like they had really no other choice. So that does bring to a conclusion the story of the last Australian bushrangers, the After Dark Bandits. Now, because I've already promoted one book, which is not my book, by the way, I have no affiliation with that particular person, I'm making a determined effort not to promote my books in this video. I will not promote either The Power of History, the first in a trilogy, or Corporate Jungle, which is a really good mystery read. Because I feel that would just be a little bit tacky, I suppose, by promoting myself after trying to sort of give a nudge to someone else. So that's this week's episode of the Pub Test. Look out shortly for an announcement as well. But if you like the content, make sure you like, you subscribe, leave a comment as well. Check out the books, do all the usual things. But thanks for watching, and we will see you on the next intriguing case of the Pub Test.